Hey, there we go. All right, we're live. Gotta put things in the right places. Okay. Do. All right. Hello to the first people just getting in. We're just getting things set up here, and I'm trying to find the right links to everything. Almost there. Let's see. Live, that's what we want. Okay, and then we want the copy link address. Get shareable link. Link copied to clipboard. Okay. Hi people coming in. Hi Ray, hi Jade, hi Kieran. Yay. Say hi when you get into the chat. Hey Brian. I'm just putting things where they gotta go here real quick, and then we will get started. Okay. There we go. Put that there. And then put this here. Cool. Okay. We should be good to go now. Sweet. Hi, everybody. Who haven't I had said hi to? Katie. Hi, Anya. Hi, Katie. Yay. I'm glad you're all here. We're talking about a bunch of different texts today, and I'm really excited to jump into it with you all. Hi, Rachel. Yeah, I'm glad you're here too. Queering Holy Week is what we're talking about this time around, and I'm really excited about it. Instead of doing what we normally do, which is like dive really deep into one specific text, we're actually going to be doing more of a I was going to say surface reading, but that's not really what I want. We're going to dig in, but we're going to look more generally at 3 readings rather than diving deep into one. So that's the plan, because Holy Week has a bunch of different readings. If you are from a tradition that has services throughout Holy Week, you might have services on, so the first Sunday of Holy Week is Palm Sunday. And then you usually don't have too many things going on Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday. People sometimes have services those days, but mostly those 3 days are kind of open. And then on Thursday, you've got Maundy Thursday. Not Monday Thursday, as I thought when I was a child, but Maundy Thursday. We can talk about that in a minute. And then Good Friday, and then Holy Saturday, and then Easter is that next Sunday. So that's sort of the whole gamut that you run, especially if you are a clergy person in a church. It is very much a marathon that you have to run from Palm Sunday to Easter. It is a lot of services. Yeah, so Jade mentioned in the chat that they have a foot washing tomorrow at church, and that is part of Maundy Thursday services usually, and we can talk a little bit about that. I know for that's going to be an interesting one. I want to hear people's feelings about that one, especially because I know a lot of people are like, why are we doing this gross thing where we have to touch people's feet, which is a completely legitimate position, I think. We've got Some Shaved Sheep. Ooh, that's a good one to say. Says, anyone else's community celebrate Ascension Day? Yeah, so sometimes Ascension Day is kind of worked into this as well. So there are other festivals going on. So that's sort of Holy Week. That's sort of the big thing. So we've got readings for Palm Sunday. We've got readings for Maundy Thursday, Good Friday, Holy Saturday, and Easter. Tonight, we're going to be looking specifically at the readings for Maundy Thursday, Good Friday, and Easter. Those are the 3 that we're going to look at today. Holy Saturday is actually my favorite day of Holy Week because it forces you to sit in this sort of silent, uncomfortable place without rushing to try to fix everything. And I find that really helpful. I didn't want to, I don't know what the word is. I didn't want to put something in Holy Saturday and what we're talking about today, because I feel like having that open space for Holy Saturday is actually better maybe to then. Anyways, I have a lot of feelings about Holy Saturday. Can you tell? Ray has indeed pointed out that Holy Saturday this year is on 420. So, if you're into that, be aware. That is also a holiday for some people. So that's what we're talking about today is Holy Week and looking at those texts. So let's see. What else do I have to say before we get started and actually looking at these texts? One thing I want to bring up before we get going. Do I have it someplace? For people that are involved in churches, for everybody really, but especially if you are a church leader, please get yourself a book like this one or other ones like this one, which is very helpful. Excuse me. This is called Preaching the Gospels Without Blaming the Jews. This is it's a lectionary commentary. But for people that work in the church, and especially during Holy Week, make sure that you are checking in with sources and people that can help make sure you're not accidentally leaning into anti-Semitism this week. Because here's the long and short of it. The long and short of it is that Jewish folks have historically been persecuted during Holy Week. Like, this is something that is still a cultural memory, because in some of the Gospels, Matthew is pretty rough about it. John, which is what we're going to be reading from, is also fairly rough about it. In the stories of Holy Week, where Jesus is crucified, there is a lot of emphasis put on in the text the fact that it's the Jews' fault. And the fact that we have that sort of anti-Semitic writing in our holy texts is something that Christians have to wrestle with. And it's especially something that we have to wrestle with if we are clergy who are preaching on this stuff. So be aware that, especially on Good Friday, there has historically been an increase in anti-Semitic hate crimes. So be aware of this, and let's see what we can do to help dismantle those interpretations that cause hate and violence, because that's not what we're going for. So that's my little note before we talk about any of Holy Week, is to get yourself a cool book like this. Also, I would also highly recommend I can't reach it from here, but it's the Jewish Annotated New Testament, which is an NRSV version of the text, but is all annotated by Jewish New Testament scholars, and it's amazing. So I would highly recommend something like that as well. So now that we've done all that, let's think about these texts. My plan is, it is 8:10 right now where I am, and my plan is to try to spend about 15 minutes on each of these three texts, and that'll get us up towards the end of our hour. So that's my plan. Okay. We're going to start out talking about John chapter 13. This year in the lectionary, if you're not familiar with the lectionary, it's the series of readings that a bunch of different churches sort of hold to about when to read which texts. And the idea is you're supposed to make it through the lectionary. The full lectionary is a 3-year cycle. So you've got your A, B, and C. So each year you may read from a different gospel during this time. This year, we are reading from the Gospel of John. So we're looking at John chapter 13 for our first reading, and this is our Maundy Thursday reading. I'm going to be reading, because all of these readings are quite long, I'm going to be just reading little bits of them. So we're going to be reading John chapter 13, verses 3 through 15. So that's the plan. And what I'm looking for is, yay, hi, Anne. Hi, Jason. What we're going to be looking for is how essentially if you're in academia at all, we're looking at querying these texts. So the idea is looking at places, there's lots of different ways to do it, but what we're going to hopefully do is look at the text and see the places where God is busting out of our binary categories and places that we want to sort of like shove God into boxes, right? And when I say God, I mean any members of the Trinity, whether it's Jesus, whether it's the Creator, whether it's the Holy Spirit. How is God busting out of our boxes? And that can include how is God busting out of gender boxes, but it can be more than that as well. So that's what I'm looking for this week. So we are going to read John 13, verses 3 through 15, and keep this question in your mind. How is God busting down and busting out of boxes in these texts? So that's the question I'm going to ask you when we're done. So Here we go. John 13, 3-15. Jesus, knowing the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going to God, got up from the table, took off his outer robe, and tied a towel around himself. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was tied around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus answered, "You do not know now what I am doing, but later you will understand." Peter said to him, "You will never wash my feet." And Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no share with me." Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, not only my feet, but also my hands and my head." Jesus said to him, "One who has bathed does not need to wash except for the feet, but is entirely clean. And though you are clean, though not all of you." For he knew who was to betray him. For this reason he said, "Not all of you are clean." After he had washed their feet, had put on his robe, and had returned to the table, he said to them, "Do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord. You are right, for that is what I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet, for I have set you an example that you also should do as I have done to you." So that's sort of our big story here of Maundy Thursday. If you are, hi Aiden, sorry Chris, sorry to miss you. If you are somebody who reads this text and goes, "What a weird thing to do," you are not alone. I think a lot of people, especially in our day and age, are kind of like, what is happening in this text? This is such a weird thing for Jesus to do, right? But in the time that this text was written, washing your feet after you came in from outside, usually from walking around in sandals, your feet are going to be really dirty, right? And at the time in Palestine, when Jesus was living there, everybody was wearing sandals. You would get dirty from walking around outside, and then you would go in, and part of washing, you usually wash your hands, but you would also wash your feet. And so that was kind of like the thing that you always did. It was just part of what happened. However, people who were not necessarily if you were kind of the lowest classes of society, you would wash your own feet. But if you were even like in the middle class of society, then you would usually have somebody wash your feet for you. And it was usually the job of a slave, and it was usually the job of, if a slave wasn't present, a woman or a female slave. Like specifically, it was based around this sort of social hierarchy of who was in charge, and people lower in the hierarchy were the ones that did the foot washing. So that's sort of the context for what's going on here. So it would have been not entirely unusual for Jesus to be like, "Hey, well, we came in from outside, we're having dinner, we should probably wash our feet." There are a couple weird things going on here, though. Number one, this is not happening like when they go in the house and before they eat dinner. This is happening after dinner. So like, that's a little weird that he like waited till now to be like, "Hey, everybody maybe wash up," right? So given some of that context, I wonder what you all see in this text that is unusual, right? Where is God changing binaries and busting out of boxes and lifting things up and turning things around like God tends to do? Where do you see that happening in this text? So that's my question for all of you. Feel free to answer in the chat, and I will read some of them as they come up. Where do you see binaries being busted? And while you type about that, I'm going to go turn my phone off because it's binging over in the corner. Hang on. Okay. So Ray says, "The fact that often a woman did the feet washing is new information to me." Yeah, true. That's not something that we often talk about. Think about like what other texts do we usually connect to with sort of foot washing and Jesus? Remember that story where Mary, actually, it's not Mary Magdalene. It's a woman who we often associate with Mary Magdalene. She washes Jesus's feet with perfume and then wipes them with her hair. That story is interesting and different for a lot of other reasons, but that's a good example of like a woman attending to a man in the way that was normal at that time. Timothy says, "God removes power struggles. Jesus puts himself beneath all of us to serve us." So yeah, there's this idea that that Jesus is turning the power system upside down, where Jesus says, "You call me teacher, but I'm washing your feet," right? Anne repeats that and says, master teacher turns servant. Yeah. Yeah, Jason connects to some of the ideas about washing and what washing does, like whether it's spiritually or physically. What does washing do? Um, Aiden says, someone who is lowly or a woman is the one who did this, but Jesus didn't care about the societal assignment of the task and did it himself. Aiden, that's where I was going with this. That's where I see things in terms of gender roles being turned upside down, right? If this is usually a task done by a lower class person and also usually by a woman, it is unusual for Jesus to take on that role himself as a man, right? So Jesus is turning that gender binary inside out. Oh, Mary wants to know more about the story of the perfume lady. We'll maybe have to do that one of these days. I don't want to get into it fully right now, but it is a really interesting story as well. Subdued Moon says, it's kind of odd that he did it when they're about to leave. Like he was preparing them to go back out into the world. Kind of off topic, but I never realized it was after they ate. Yeah, so I think Subdued, you made a good point there, that they're doing it after the meal, right as they're about to like sort of go out into the world, right? I think that's exactly why. I think that's why it's weird that he didn't do it before they ate, but maybe he did it intentionally because he's saying, now I'm sending you out, right? The very end of this text that we didn't read all the way through, the very end is Jesus saying, the famous line about, do as I have done to you and love others. By this, they will know that you are my servants, right? So I definitely think it is ascending, and that is why it's happening at the end of the meal. Yes, perfume. I feel bad that we're calling her perfume lady, but she doesn't get a name in the story either. So we'll maybe talk about that one in the future too. Rachel says, Jesus is associating with the lowly and with women in this act. Yes, so maybe not only is Jesus turning the gender expectations upside down, and that's like sort of theoretically interesting, but also Jesus is intentionally throwing in his lot with those people, right? That Jesus is intentionally saying, I am with those people in taking this act on. And I think that teaches us something about how we are supposed to react to those people, right? Like I kind of put myself in the mind of the disciples and think like, okay, this person that I super respect is doing what I would think of as like a denigrating act. But then what are they going to think every time after this when somebody washes their feet? They're going to think like, oh, remember that time Jesus did that weird thing? And they're going to have theoretically, I hope, I hope that this is what happened, that ever after, when somebody washes their feet, they look at that person and they see Jesus because they have that memory, right? So Jesus isn't just changing things in that moment. He's changing their whole memory, the disciples' whole memory about this act for the rest of their lives. They're going to remember that time Jesus did this, and then they're going to treat the people that do that for them in the rest of their lives better. And then hopefully Jesus acts as an example and says, this is what you're also supposed to do. So yeah, it changes things, it turns things upside down. It gives a better, hopefully people will treat people in that role better in the future. And also the disciples will hopefully put themselves in that role more in the future. Does that make sense? Yeah. Let's see. Yes, Ray also turns some class expectations upside down. Yeah. Good. I'm glad we're all digging this. What other things stand out to you from this text? Again, this is John 13, 3 through 15. What else stands out to you about this text? I find it really interesting that Jesus takes in verse 4, it says, Jesus got up from the table, took off his outer robe, and tied a towel around himself. And then he wipes the feet of the disciples with that towel that's tied around him. And then later on in verse 12, after he washes their feet, he puts the robe back on. That movement of undressing is a really interesting one to me when we think about the importance of our bodies, right? To me, this idea that Jesus takes off some part of his outer, like, I don't think it's like a jacket like we think of it's not like an outdoor coat, right? This is something that clearly everybody is wearing indoors, but it's still an outer layer. So maybe you could think of it like a blazer, maybe like an undershirt and a blazer is kind of the modern day equivalent. But the fact that Jesus is taking off some clothing in order to do this thing is interesting to me. It makes me think about the clothes that we use to define our roles in society, and the fact that Jesus is sort of taking on a different role, and so he has to shed the clothes associated with the master and teacher that he was. Like think of it like, this person you really respect who's got like a suit jacket on, taking that jacket off, just getting down to their shirt sleeves and rolling their sleeves up. Like that gives you a different sense of what this person is doing and the role they're taking on than it would if you saw them in a suit jacket, which gives them more of an authoritative personality. Does that make sense? Let's see. Yeah, so Aiden says, do you think that by Jesus doing the feet washing can also be symbolic to Jesus washing away sin? I think that's what, I forget who it was that said something like that earlier. Hold on, I'm going to find out who it was. Jason said something about that earlier. Like, what is the spiritual ramification of this, right? And I think it's interesting in this text that we have, like, first of all, Anne says it could be a baptism allusion, right? First of all, you've got Jesus saying, I would like to wash all of your feet. And then Simon Peter saying, no, you can't do that. That's like beneath you. And then Jesus saying, but I have to if you want to have any sort of store in what I do. And then Peter's like, okay, cool, then wash all of me, right? And then Jesus says, you don't actually need all of you to be washed. Like, to me, let's see if I can find the right verse here. Jesus said to him, one who has bathed does not need to wash except for the feet, but is entirely clean. So this idea that like you're already clean except for this one bit of you that's sort of been like swishing around in the dirt outside, right? But in general, you're already pretty clean. And then he says, and you are clean, though not all of you. And the you he's using there is the communal you. So he's saying like you as a group are already clean, but not the entire group. And then it says, for he knew who was to betray him. So he's referencing Judas, right? So you've got this idea that there is some part of the disciples that needs to be washed because of just like being a human being. But in general, he's calling them already clean, which I find really interesting. This sort of balance between like, it's not like you're bad, right? You're not dirty and gross. It's just that you kind of need an everyday upkeep. So I think about it less as like a full-on baptism, as like more of a like, I don't know, remembrance of baptism to sort of connect it to us. Like you just kind of need a top up every once in a while. Ray says, by wearing the dirty towel, he's symbolically wearing or taking on sin or uncleanness of the feet. Interesting. Yeah, so there's this idea that Jesus is clearly like holding on to that. It's not that he's just washing this dirt off into the water. He's also drying the feet with a towel. So like there could be something about Jesus taking on some of that, which I think is interesting. Anne says, Jesus' ministry opens and begins with water baptism and ends his ministry with foot washing. So there could be a connection there as well. I like it. I love all these connections that y'all are making. This is great. Okay, well, I think we have to move on to our next text. I said it was going to be rough to get through all three of these texts because there's so much to talk about in every one of them. Yeah, there's just so much to say. But so this is our Maundy Thursday text, right? And I think we did get to some of the queer stuff about this text, right? The turning upside down of institutions, of gender roles, of class, the association that Jesus makes where he puts himself with the least powerful members of the society at the time, where he is specifically taking on things that denigrate him and telling the disciples that they need to do this also, and by extension saying Christians need to do this also. So yeah, there's a lot of sort of academically queer stuff going on in this text, which I really like. So the next text we're going to be looking at is the Good Friday text, and this one, honestly, I mean, Good Friday texts, man, they're rough, and we could have an entire conversation about why we call this Good Friday. The long and the short of it, for folks that aren't familiar, because I remember being a kid and being new to this stuff and asking, like, why do we call it Good Friday if that's the day Jesus dies? There's nothing good about that. The phrase Good Friday, or the name Good Friday, comes from this idea that it is a good day because in that moment, through Jesus's death, we are reconciled to God. So there's oh, Rachel says, yeah, my Bible study kids asked the same question too, and it was hard to answer. Yes, it is hard to answer. So the idea is that it's good because through Jesus's actions on Good Friday, we are reconnected to God. And a lot of that comes out of what we call the theory of the full name is penal substitutionary atonement. And that's this idea that human beings deserved punishment for their sins, and Jesus took that punishment so that human beings didn't have to. And so in that moment, human beings could be reconciled to God, the Creator, because Jesus took the punishment for us. And so that's sort of the general explanation for penal substitutionary atonement. And the one that I think most Christians are familiar with, right? Because it's talked about, there's a lot that is based in that idea of substitutionary atonement in Paul's letters, and a lot of Christianity is based on Paul's letters, right? So that's the thing I think that most Christians are familiar with. However, this may be new to you as it was new to me several years ago, that that's not the only theory for how to understand what happens when Jesus dies on the cross and is resurrected. There are other theories of atonement that aren't just penal substitutionary atonement. So there are three, penal substitutionary atonement is one of three really famous ones, but there are multiple different theories about how we understand what Jesus does and how it changes our relationship with God. Actually, I'm going to show you another cool resource that I found really helpful. Ooh, here we go. This book here is called Making Sense of the Cross, and it's by David J. Lose, who actually was a teacher at the seminary I went to. Making Sense of the Cross is a really easy read if you are somebody that's not super into theology. It's written for people who just are kind of like, I'm interested, but I don't really know very much. And it's written like a dialogue. So you can see this, it's written like two people are talking together. So it makes it really easy to read because you're just like reading somebody's conversation. But this book will talks all about the major theories of atonement and how they work. And so I'd highly recommend it. It's just a little teeny book. But if you want to get a copy of this, it's really helpful to just kind of get an idea of how people understand this, if penal substitutionary atonement isn't your gig. So there you go. Rachel says, hold on a second. Okay, Rachel says, I told my kids that even though what happened to Christ was super brutal, that what was good was that Jesus didn't back away from his call, that Jesus was brave anyway. I tried, lol. Yeah, it's really hard to explain to kids. And I think it's hard to explain to anybody, right? Excuse me. I think I personally am not a fan of penal substitutionary atonement. That is not many other people have pointed out the way that theory of atonement can feed directly into abuse in a lot of situations. This idea that God is angry and somebody has to be punished leads to a lot of really toxic theology. And so we have to be so careful about how we, even if that is the version of atonement theology that makes the most sense for us, we have to be incredibly careful about how we use it. Because especially if you're trying to explain it to a kid, right? Explaining well, Good Friday is good because God killed Jesus and that was good for us. There's so much happening there, right? So we have to be really careful about how we make sense of this. And that's why I think it's good to have an understanding of other theories, even a basic understanding of other theories, because it can help us understand the strengths and the weaknesses of each theory. Rachel says, I'm not a fan either, and my church is very centered around liberation and justice, so that's what made it so hard. Yeah, so there are other theories of atonement that feed more into the liberation of people and, in general, seem to have better theological outcomes. Yeah, so Jade just dropped a couple of names in here. Recapitulation, ransom, and satisfaction. Those are 3 possible theories. There are some other ones as well. And these are theories. These aren't like new theories. These are theories that that church Christians have been talking about basically since the 1st century. Like, Jesus died and then rose, and how do we understand all of this? So there are lots of different theories. I would recommend checking some of them out because you might find one that feels less gross than penal substitutionary atonement tends to, at least for me. So now that we've said all that, let's look at this Good Friday text. Good Friday is the day that we read the text about Jesus's crucifixion. So again, we're going to be reading John. We are going to be reading John chapter 19, verses 16 through 30. Chapter 19, verses 16 through 30. Let's read through that. And again, we're looking for the same thing here. We're looking for places where God is busting out of our binaries or turning things upside down or making us think differently than we would in terms of our general ideas about humanity and what it means to be human. So let's read this text. John 19, 16 through 30. So they took Jesus, and carrying the cross by himself, he went out to what is called the place of the skull, which in Hebrew is called Golgotha. There they crucified him, and with him 2 others, one on either side, with Jesus between them. Pilate also had an inscription written and put on the cross. It read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." Many of the Jews read this inscription because the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Hebrew, in Latin, and in Greek. Then the chief priests of the Jews said to Pilate, "Do not write the King of the Jews, but rather, this man said, 'I am the King of the Jews.'" Pilate answered, "What I have written, I have written." When the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took his clothes and divided them into 4 parts, one for each soldier. Then they also took his tunic. Now the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from the top. So they said to one another, "Let us not tear it, but cast lots for it to see who will get it." This was to fulfill what the scripture says. "They divided my clothes among themselves, and for my clothing they cast lots." And that is what the soldiers did. Meanwhile, standing near the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing beside her, he said to his mother, "Woman, here is your son." Then he said to the disciple, "Here is your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her into his own home. After this, when Jesus knew that all was now finished, he said, in order to fulfill the scripture, "I am thirsty." A jar full of sour wine was standing there, so they put a sponge full of the wine on a branch of hyssop and held it to his mouth. When Jesus had received the wine, he said, "It is finished." Then he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. So, that's a lot. I wonder what you see in this text that is Jesus busting out of boxes and breaking down our human ideas about things. Dan says, "I tend to talk about those who didn't have the opportunity to hear the good news. Jesus died so he could offer salvation to those who never knew him. He descended before being resurrected." Yeah, so Dan, you're kind of bringing up that idea of how to understand the good part of Good Friday, which I appreciate. So where do you see Jesus breaking down human conceptions of things here? Where do you see Jesus breaking open binaries? I'm going to have a drink while y'all think about it and type about it. So Ray brings up the disciple who Jesus loved. Why is the disciple he loved? Historically, in the early church, it was thought that John, the author of this gospel, was the disciple that Jesus loved. So that was kind of the original, not the original, it was the first sort of general conception of it, was that John was this disciple, and that's why he wrote this text. There have been thoughts more recently that say, I don't think that makes sense. But yeah, we get this, yeah, maybe a little narcissistic. Yeah, we've got this disciple who Jesus loved. And it's interesting that he's not named. So you got, meanwhile, standing near the cross of Jesus were his mother's sister Mary, Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing beside her, like this disciple isn't named. And also in that first like roundup of people standing there, he's not included, but then all of a sudden he's there. So what do we make of that? Rachel points out that usually women aren't named. True. So yeah, actually, when you first read the text and it just says the disciple whom Jesus loved, I almost want to be like, wait, was it Mary Magdalene, or like was it one of the women that were standing there? But then when he says, "Woman, here is your son," that seems like it maybe puts a gender on that person. However, who knows? You could have a different reading of that. What else we got going on here? Many Marys, true. Miriam would have been her name back in the day, but then became Mary through Greek and Latin. Subdued Moon says, isn't it kind of odd he entrusted his mother to a disciple? What would have happened to her if he hadn't said that? Would she have gone to family? Yeah. So it's interesting that Jesus specifically says, here's a new family member for you. And especially because we know from the gospel text that Jesus had other siblings. We don't know, I don't think we know if Joseph has died at this point. I don't think we hear about that. But we know that Jesus has other siblings, has brothers, in fact. So yeah, Mary would have been taken care of by Jesus's brothers. So it might be that he specifically wants somebody to take care of Mary, but like in terms of sort of the socioeconomic bit of the time, but she technically would have had other people to take care of her. So why does Jesus give Mary this new son? Why does she do that? Yeah, everybody's like, wait, where's Joseph? No, I don't know. Like, that's the thing, is we don't know where Joseph is at this point. Joseph, the husband of Mary, right? Like, we don't have an idea about if Joseph was alive at the point when Jesus died to take care of Mary, because he's not mentioned. Throughout the like later parts of the Gospels, we hear about Jesus's mother and brothers, but we don't hear about Jesus's stepdad at all. So if Joseph had still been alive at this point, if he was still alive, he still would be taking care of Mary in the socioeconomic sense. But I just meant, even if he had died, Jesus had other brothers who would have taken care of Mary. So yeah, Mary would have had people to live with. So why does Jesus make this connection and say, here's your new son? Why does he do that if not to just take care of her socioeconomically? Ray says, a point can be made that maybe Jesus knew the disciple needed Mary more than Mary needed him. I think that's a totally legitimate thing. This idea that maybe it wasn't that Mary needed somebody, maybe this disciple who Jesus loved was going to be in such a deep period of mourning that like he needed some help. He needed a family member, right? I think that totally makes sense. I think it also makes sense to think about Mary as not necessarily needing the socioeconomic support, but as needing somebody who knew Jesus. Like if you think about, for instance, somebody's child dying, right? And how often that family will sort of almost adopt the very close friends of their child, right? That somebody who is alive, who is usually around the same age as your child was, and who knew your child as almost as well as you did, right? Like, I think it makes sense, this idea that maybe Mary also needed that sense of somebody else to grieve with. So yeah, Subdued Moon says they needed each other in grief. Yeah, I think that kind of makes sense. That to me is the queerest part of this text, is this moment where Jesus says, I'm breaking down the family by blood only sort of way that we're understanding family and saying, you know what, this sort of found family is going to be a really important thing now. Jesus does that throughout his ministry, right? Like when his mother and brothers come to see him, and then he says, these people that are with me are my mother and my brothers, right? Yeah, so the found family thing, I think, is very strong in Jesus's ministry. And so for me, that's a moment where Jesus busts boxes, where he says, hey, my family is not just the people that are blood related to me, and they're not just the people that are blood related to you. They're the people that are your family are the people that are with you in that moment, whether it's that moment of suffering or that moment of connection in some way. So yeah, it's a sort of a found family thing. Anne says, water becomes thicker than blood. Interesting thing, and that saying used to be different than we associate it with. So we usually say blood is thicker than water, but the original saying was, what is it? The blood of the womb is, how does it go? Yeah, the blood, that's what it is. Thanks, Jade. The blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb. So the idea was that the original saying was actually about how the people that you tie yourself to in life are stronger. Like that bond is stronger than the people who just birthed you, which, yeah. So it's interesting that over time that saying changed its meaning. Now we think of it as people that you're blood related to are always, like, those connections are stronger than found family ones. But anyways, we digress. Oh, but Anne points out there could be something about the water of baptism too. So if we think about it that way, it might mean something different. So anyways, so yeah, that's the moment where I see like the queerest part of this text is in this sort of found family moment. Okay, we've only got 15 minutes left, so we got to go to our Easter text because I don't want to leave us in Good Friday. Let's talk about our last text, our Easter text, which is John chapter 20. And we're going to be reading verses 1 through 18. So again, I'm going to read this, and then we're going to talk about the places where God is busting binaries and turning things upside down. So John chapter 20, verses 1 through 18. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and she said to them, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." Then Peter and the other disciple set out and went toward the tomb. The two were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent down to look in and saw the linen wrappings lying there, but he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came, following him, and went into the tomb. He saw the linen wrappings lying there, and the cloth that had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen wrappings, but rolled up in a place by itself. Then the other disciple who reached the tomb first also went in, and he saw and believed. For as yet they did not understand the scripture, that he must rise from the dead. Then the disciples returned to their homes. But Mary stood weeping outside the tomb. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb, and she saw two angels in white, sitting where the body of Jesus had been lying, one at the head and the other at the feet. They said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" And she said to them, "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." When she had said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you looking for?" Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." And Jesus said to her, "Mary." And she turned to him and said in Hebrew, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said to her, "Do not hold on to me, because I have not yet ascended to the Father. But go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them that he had said these things to her. So, also a lot going on in that text. What do you think? Where do you think? Where are things being turned upside down? Where are binaries being broken? What do you see here? One thing that's just a random tidbit, random fact. When Mary says Rabboni to Jesus, that's not actually in Hebrew. That's actually in Aramaic. So it's interesting that the text says she turned to him and said in Hebrew. Like, why? Because that's Aramaic, not Hebrew. Interesting. I don't know why the text does that. What's going on in this text for you all? Jade says he made his announcement to a woman first. Yay! I love that you bring that up. Yeah, that's big. That's big. It was a woman who shared the good news first with the other disciples. Yeah. So we've got a lot of in this text, we've got a lot of it does almost feel a little narcissistic, where a lot of people are trying to be like, I saw Jesus first, right? Or I believed first, or I talked to him first. There's a lot of that going on in this text, because you got the two disciples running to the tomb, right? And then the disciple who Jesus loved beat the other guy and got there first. And he's also the first person who saw and believed, right? So like there's a little bit of bragging going on here if John really was the beloved disciple. But then you've actually got Mary, the first person who talks to Jesus and who delivers the news. Mary Magdalene is the first gospel preacher, essentially. Yeah. Oh, cool. A lot of other people are saying that the ESV and other translations do say in Aramaic. Good. So, yeah, I think we recognize that it is Aramaic, and so some translations have specifically changed that to make it right, even though it's not right in the original text. Jade says she recognized him by his voice and not by seeing him. Yeah, so the moment where Mary recognizes Jesus, so she turns to him. Verse 14 says, when she had said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not know it was Jesus. So she's looking like directly at him and doesn't know that it's him. And preachers throughout time have come up with a bajillion reasons why this could be, right? Like maybe she's crying so hard she can't see through her tears, or maybe Jesus has disguised himself some way. Like we don't know why Mary can't figure out who he is. But he speaks to her and says, why are you weeping and whom are you looking for? And even when he speaks to her at first, she still doesn't know that it's him. So there's something too that's like he doesn't necessarily sound like himself there exactly either. And we don't know why, or she doesn't recognize his voice. It's not until Jesus says her name that suddenly it's like, bing. There's something about her. Something about Jesus saying her name specifically and naming her that clicks for her. And that to me is fascinating. Yeah, Rachel says it's such an interesting part. It's nice that she recognizes him at that point. Yeah. To me, that is one of the most interesting parts about this whole text, is that it's not until Jesus names her that she recognizes him. Ooh, Jade's connecting this to the story of the Good Shepherd. The sheep will know the shepherd when he calls. The idea that the sheep know, the shepherd calls the name of each sheep, and the sheep know the voice and know their name being called, right? Rachel says, it makes me think of how important it is for folks to have their names used. Yes! Thank you for bringing that, Rachel. That, to me, is the queer point of this text, is that immediately when I hear that, I hear about the importance of names, right? I hear about the importance of being called by name, the importance of being called by your right name, the importance of, and I think I would be interested in thinking about the way that names, this is like getting real deep, but like thinking about the way names are changed because we're reading this text that was a translation of a Greek and Latin text. We have sort of one version that's in Greek, one version that's in Latin, and it's sort of lots of times it's combinations of those two. But because it's written in Greek and Latin, the Hebrew names of the people involved are changed into Greek and Latin for the writing. So for instance, all of the Marys in these texts, their names would have actually been Miriam, and then they're changed in the Greek and Latin into Mary. And there's something to me that is interesting about the idea of thinking about Jesus calling her by her real Hebrew name rather than by the name of the Greek or Roman Empire that she would have been a part of. Like the idea of Jesus calling her Miriam in that moment and not using her sort of empire given name is something that kind of like makes me all tingly. So anyways, I would be interested to think more and talk more about that. Okay, hold on. Subdued Moon says it could be just beyond belief at first. There's something very intimate about a loved one saying your name. Yeah, Rachel says the same thing underneath. It implies intimacy and tenderness. This idea of somebody saying your name, and especially because he's not saying anything after that. All he says is Mary. Like it's like he's speaking a magic word, right? Like there is a complete intimacy in that moment, and I think that's why this relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene is something that so many people have tried to figure out, like what's going on. Like lots of people read it as a romantic relationship, specifically because there seems to be a very close, like an intimate relationship between these two people. And I think one way of queering this text might be to say, maybe this is a relationship that is beyond what we understand in our culture as a, what's the word I want? Not acceptable, but as a normal relationship. This is not a normal relationship. And so trying to say it's a romantic relationship or it's just a friendship or it's any of the ways that we categorize relationships, like those are human ways of understanding relationships, and it makes me wonder if this relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene is something outside of the social boxes that we tend to put relationships in. Does that make sense? Jade says maybe a queer platonic relationship, and Rachel says queer love is expansive. Yeah, so this idea that like maybe this is a kind of love that we don't really have a label for, and that's okay. The idea that this is a love beyond labels is a very queer ideal. I like it. Yeah, Subdued Moon says just because it's a man and a woman who are close doesn't mean it has to be romantic. Totally agree. I think there are completely, like it's completely legitimate to read this as a non-romantic relationship. But I do like the idea that maybe this is just a relationship that's beyond how we understand relationships to be. Yeah, so anyways, yay, I'm so glad this is all coming out. This is so much fun. Okay, we're down to our last 5 minutes, y'all, so we can't go too much further into this, but is there anything else that really jumps out to you about this Easter passage? Anything else that you read through and you're like, oh, that's interesting, or that breaks boxes or turns things around? Is there anything else that comes up for you? I'll give you a second. I'm going to have some more water. Yeah, Jade points out, excuse me. Jade points out that there is definitely a stigma around the kind of death that Jesus died, and the fact that he is risen out of that is really important. This idea that people, it reminds me of that that Mexican proverb about they tried to bury us and they didn't know we were seeds. This idea that that Jesus died in a way that looked shameful to the world, but turned out to not be shameful. Does that make sense? Like, I think there's something in there as well to dig around with. Let's see. Oh yeah, Anne's giving us some Greek. I love it. I love it. Oh, interesting, Jade. Jade says in Greek or Roman myths, if you died a shameful death, you didn't resurrect. Interesting. Interesting. Rachel says, my kids asked why they had to embarrass him. Oh, yeah, that, like, oh my gosh, especially to, like, I don't know, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th graders, that idea of, like, that Jesus is led through this gamut of shame before his crucifixion is just heartrending. Like, it's heartrending to adults, but I think to young people who are much more attuned to that, it really sucks. It sucks to read. You like feel it, I think, a lot more in some ways. Yeah. Yeah, Rachel. Okay, so Rachel said, I told them that I imagined it would scare people from following him and mimicking him. Yeah, I mean, the idea really is to shame Jesus. Like in the moment, the idea is to shame Jesus so that people, to make an example of him, to say anybody who follows this guy is going to have the same thing happen to them. So it really is about scaring Jesus's followers. Ooh, Ray. Busting this out. Ray says, so many male pastors would not even meet with women in private. I love that Jesus isn't afraid of intimate relationships with women and it doesn't keep them out. Yeah, so like, I mean, I think we have to be obviously aware of the safety of all people involved. But given the fact that this is specifically the case of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, right? Like, yeah, the fact that Jesus doesn't say like, uh, I don't know, that he's not afraid of that relationship. Yeah, I really like that. Um, in terms of how pastors relate to women today, whatever keeps women safe is, I think, what Jesus would probably be on the side of. And but yeah, it does it the discourse that we have today about male pastors not meeting with women smacks way more of pastors being afraid of the reputation being tarnished than it does care for the people that are around them. So anyhow, that's a whole thing. Um, well, I think we have to leave it there because we're almost 2 minutes to 9 here. But this has been such a fun time. I'm so glad we got to do this. Thank you all for being involved and for commenting and for telling me what you think and what you feel about this stuff. Um, Holy Week is a big time, and it's all leading. I was going to say it's all leading up to Easter, but I don't want us to jump to Easter. Let yourself sit in Holy Saturday if you can this week. And remember that we can't always jump to the good part at the end because we have to let ourselves and God be working in the world. Like we live, to me, so who was it? Anne Lamott. I think Anne Lamott said we're Easter people living in a Good Friday world. And while I appreciate that, I'm way more on the side of we are living in a Holy Saturday world where bad stuff has happened and is happening, and we are waiting for the moment of resurrection, and we need to be waiting and thinking and feeling and working in that period. So to me, Holy Saturday is like the closest to where we actually are in time right now. But anyways, all of that having been said, I hope you have a great Holy Week and a wonderful Easter on Sunday. And thank you all for being here. The last thing I'll say is that our next meeting will be Wednesday, May 1st, and we'll be doing our afternoon one that day. So that'll be earlier on in the day, but you can find all about that on my whole social media, all that stuff. And if you want to get involved with the Trans and Christian Support Group, that happens on the alternating Wednesdays. So that'll be happening next week, the 24th. And so if you want to get involved with that, you can go to bit.ly/trans Christian support to sign up. And very lastly, thank you to all of the Patreon patrons that make these discussions happen. You all get to contribute to the work that I'm doing, and I so appreciate it because this stuff couldn't happen without you. So if you want to be a Patreon patron, you can go over to patreon.com/Austin Lionheart and get involved there. All right. Thank you, everybody. Blessed Holy Week to you all, and we will see you here next time. Peace.